Okay, let's unpack this.
Let's do it.
When you and I talk about financial accountability in government, our minds usually jump straight to, modern stuff.
Sure. External audits, asset declarations, very rigid conflict of interest laws.
Exactly. We sort of treat these ideas like they're the intellectual property of the modern age. Hard-won concepts.
Right. Things we invented in the last century or two.
But what if I told you that the ethical blueprint for all of this was actually laid down almost 1,400 years ago? And not by some committee or some complex law, but by one person's act of profound voluntary self-scrutiny.
And that's what's so incredible about this case. It's more than just a nice historical story. It's a foundational legal moment.
How so?
It fundamentally defined the entire relationship between a ruler and public money. We're going to be diving into a single case from the very, very dawn of the Islamic State of Medina. And this case, it established what you could call the world's earliest model for the public trust.
So our mission today, for you listening, is a deep dive into that specific moment. Think of it as a shortcut to understanding how these ethical foundations were really forged, and forged under incredible pressure. We're examining the voluntary audit of the first Caliph, Abu Bakr al-Siddiq.
An audit he conducted on himself upon his death.
Right, and the beauty of this precedent, as you pointed out, is just how it flips our expectations of power.
It really does. The idea was simple. The highest office in the land required the absolute highest degree of restriction, not privilege, restriction.
Which brings us to the core question that sort of hangs over this whole story. How did this ruler set a standard of transparency so impossibly high that his successor, the famously tough, famously uncompromising Caliph Umar, how did it make him weep?
It's an incredible scene to imagine.
We're focusing on the account found in the series, Islamic Legal Precedents, Judgments of the Rightly Guided Caliphs, drawing a lot from the research of Mr. Zahir Ahmad Mir. We're calling this deep dive the first audit of Islamic governance.
Because it wasn't just a moral choice he made, it became a legal precedent. It anchored this entire concept of public office being a demanding, almost sacred trust.
It's the ultimate lesson in the difference between, say, legal compliance and ethical necessity.
That's a perfect way to put it. It shows that the integrity of any government system is always, first and foremost, reflected in the personal conduct of the person right at the top.
Okay, so let's start at the beginning. Part 1. Public office is a trust, or amana. To really get why Abu Bakr's final actions were so dramatic, we have to understand the context.
The context is everything.
We're in the period immediately after the passing of the Prophet Muhammad. Medina is in this rapid transition. It's going from a small, nascent community to a full-blown state.
And it's happening fast. Abu Bakr has been pledged allegiance. He's just inherited this immense, sudden responsibility of leading a community that's expanding by the day.
Now, Abu Bakr was known for his piety, of course, his closeness to the Prophet, but he was also... he was a working man.
He was a merchant, a successful one. He traded in cloth. So he was financially independent. He was completely used to earning his own living, providing for his family through his own work.
And this is where we hit the first, just astonishing dilemma. The sources are clear on this. After taking on the role of Caliph, the highest office of the state, he still gets up the next morning and walks to the marketplace.
To sell his wares.
To sell cloth.
When you just stop and think about that, it's almost unthinkable for a head of state today.
It's wild.
But it tells you everything you need to know about the original foundational philosophy of leadership in this new state. The idea was that power should not automatically grant you wealth. A leader should sustain himself.
But the reality of governing quickly starts to collide with that ideal.
It had to. The job of the caliph. I mean, you're managing military campaigns, you're arbitrating legal disputes, you're setting financial policy for the entire state, you're meeting emissaries.
Leading prayers, guiding the community.
The workload was all-consuming. It's a 247 job.
And the other companions, they saw this conflict immediately, didn't they?
Oh, yeah. They recognized the logistical problem right away. You just can't effectively run a government that needs every hour of your day, while you're also trying to run a private business that needs just as much attention.
It's a conflict of time, first and foremost.
A conflict of time, and then ultimately a conflict of loyalty. Because what happens the moment the state's best interest clashes with what's best for the market or for your business? The leader faces an impossible choice.
So they needed a solution. A pragmatic one that let him do his job full-time, but without breaking that core principle that the office isn't for personal enrichment.
Exactly.
So what did the state treasury, the fledgling state treasury, come up with?
The Beit al-Mal, the public treasury, stepped in. The decision was made to grant him a financial provision. But here's the critical part. They didn't call it a salary. It was explicitly defined as a small stipend, an allowance.
Okay, help us unpack that distinction. A stipend versus a salary. Why is that specific word choice so important here in 7th century Medina?
It's crucial, and it's really where the legal precedent begins to form. A salary, implies a payment for your labor, for your expertise. It's a wage. You're entitled to it. You can keep it. You can save it. You can invest it.
Right. It's yours.
It's yours. A stipend, in this specific context, was seen as something totally different. It was viewed as sustenance. It was only designed to cover his immediate essential needs.
Like what?
Food, clothing, shelter. For himself and for his immediate family. That's it.
Yeah.
The whole purpose was to sustain the man so he could do the job, not to reward the ruler for being the ruler.
So the goal of the stipend was just to remove the distraction of him having to earn a living.
Precisely. To allow him to focus 100% on the state. But it also placed this very severe, very specific restriction on his ability to consume and accumulate wealth.
And how's the amount decided?
The companions agreed it had to be strictly defined by necessity. It was calculated based on the frugal standard of a typical person living in Medina, maybe a little bit more, to account for the demands of the office, like hosting guests, but it was certainly not a path to wealth.
So that established an immediate legal principle.
It did. State support for the head of state is defined by function and by necessity, nothing more.
And this leads us right to that core concept of amanah. We often translate it simply as trust, but you said before it carries a much heavier weight. How did this stipend decision solidify that concept?
Amanah it's like being entrusted with a deposit, something you are morally and spiritually responsible for protecting. By accepting that stipend from the Beit Mal, Abu Bakr was publicly confirming that the entire treasury was a deposit. It belonged to the whole community and ultimately to God.
So he wasn't the owner.
Not at all. He was the primary trustee. And if the trustee, the head of state, misuses that trust or takes even a little more than is necessary, he's violating that divine and public trust.
So the moment he took that first bit of stipend, he basically submitted himself to intense public scrutiny.
Exactly. He formalized the fact that he was, in essence, the state's most senior civil servant, and also its most restricted.
Which leads us to the guiding principle, the ratio decidendi, that was implicitly established right here.
No one may take from public wealth except what is due and necessary.
That wasn't just a friendly suggestion, was it?
It was the ruling. It was the principle that defined governance from day one. And the truly stunning part, which his final audit reinforces, is that the Caliph himself was the very first person this rule was applied to. And he applied it most severely to himself.
That foundation of amanah, that feeling that he was carrying this spiritual weight by using public funds, even when it was totally illegal, that's what sets the stage for the dramatic end of his life.
Absolutely. It's the key to understanding everything that comes next.
Okay, let's move into part 2, the ultimate act of voluntary scrutiny. So the logistical problem of him earning a living is solved by the stipend, but this ethical and spiritual problem of being constantly entangled with state resources, that remained.
It clearly weighed on him.
So we fast forward a few years. Abu Bakr has successfully led the state through its most difficult phase, the stabilization wars, consolidating governance. But then he falls ill, and he recognizes that his life is coming to an end.
And this is the moment. This is where we see that philosophical principle of amanah turn into concrete, physical, legal action. Most rulers on their deathbed, they're worried about securing their succession, maybe transferring their private estates to their children.
Right, shoring up their dynasty.
Abu Bakr's primary concern was something else entirely. It was clearing his ledger, his spiritual and his public ledger.
He didn't send for his accountants or his administrators. He called for his daughter, Aisha.
The wife of the prophet, a hugely respected figure in her own right. He called her to give his final personal instruction about the state assets he had been using.
And his focus wasn't on distributing assets. It was on returning them.
Yes. And we need to be crystal clear for you listening. The items he was returning were not things he had bought with his stipend money. That money was for his family's food and clothing. These were state-owned assets.
Tools of the office.
Exactly. Tools of the office that he had been using in his capacity as Caliph, drawn directly from the Beit Mal for his use.
So what were they? What were the two specific items?
The two items were the land and the camel.
Okay, what do they represent functionally?
The land, historians generally agree, was likely a small plot of land or maybe a small facility. It might have been allocated for his residence or maybe for growing some basic crops for his family's sustenance since he no longer had his merchant income. The camel was, well, it was the 7th century equivalent of an official state car.
A necessary means of transport.
Absolutely. Drawn from the state's own stock of animals, required for official travel, for meeting delegations, for administering a huge and growing territory.
So to be clear, these were things that, legally speaking, he was almost certainly justified in using as the head of state.
Completely. This isn't a story about him being caught hoarding gold or luxury silks. He was returning the functional equivalent of a government-provided house and an official vehicle.
And the reason he gave, the direct quote that really forms the core of this whole precedent. It explains why this matters so much.
It does. It's incredibly powerful. His stated reason was, "Return the land and the camel that I took from the Treasury for my use. I wish to meet my lord free of the burden of public wealth."
Free of the burden. Let's slow down and really analyze that phrase. Why was it a burden if his use of it was legally justified?
That's the whole question, isn't it? The burden comes from that profound spiritual weight of mamana. In this ethical framework, legality is just the absolute minimum standard. It's the floor, not the ceiling.
So what was the burden then?
The burden is recognizing that even if he used that camel for official state business 99% of the time, that tiny, lingering 1% of potential personal benefit, maybe a quick trip to see a relative that wasn't strictly state business, or even just the simple fact that he was using an asset that belonged to the poor and the needy of the community that constituted a debt.
Wow.
He felt that it required either spiritual repayment or, in this case, physical return of the asset itself.
So he was setting a standard where even the perception or the potential for a conflict of interest had to be purged before he could consider his account settled.
Precisely. His actions cements this belief that your personal conscience, your accountability to a higher standard, has to supersede any earthly privilege you might have. He was basically performing a preemptive divine audit on himself because he feared the tiny discrepancies that might slip past a human one.
It's effectively a final declaration of assets and liabilities as he's exiting the office. But it's enforced by his own religious conviction, not by any law on the books at the time.
And that voluntary nature is what makes this precedent so unique and, frankly, so challenging to follow.
And the emotional aftermath, the reaction of his successor, it just underscores how extraordinary everyone at the time thought this was.
Yes. After Abu Bakr's death, the next caliph, Umar, comes across the returned property.
And we should remind everyone, Umar was known for his severity, his meticulous nature, his absolute intolerance for any kind of corruption. This was not a man given to, sentimental displays.
Not at all.
So what was his reaction when he saw the returned land and camel?
The historical records say that he wept. He just broke down and wept upon seeing them. And it wasn't a simple sadness for his friend. It was this sudden, crushing realization of the terrifying standard that had just been set for him and for all future leaders.
And his lament, that famous quote, "May Allah have mercy on Abu Bakr. He has set a standard that will exhaust those who come after him."
Exhaust those who come after him.
Why exhaust? What was the specific difficulty he was seeing?
He saw that Abu Bakr had just elevated the job description. The expectation of a ruler went from mere legal compliance to absolute ethical sacrifice. And that's exhausting.
Because checking boxes is easy.
Checking boxes is achievable, right? You follow the rules, you fill out the forms. But this standard of being free of the burden of public wealth that requires constant internal ethical self-policing, it demands the proactive rejection of nearly every personal benefit that comes with the office.
It actively discourages the natural human tendency to seek comfort, to accumulate things.
Yes. For Umar, taking on the office of caliph now meant he had to submit himself to that precedent. He knew that if the first caliph, the prophet's closest companion, the most pious of men, went to these lengths, then he and every ruler who came after him had to at least strive for that same impossible degree of purity.
The exhaustion wasn't physical.
No, it was the mental and the moral strain of living in the shadow of that kind of voluntary sacrifice. This standard ensures that anyone who really understands the job views it not as a golden opportunity, but as a severe, life-altering test.
The power of that story is just immense. But let's transition now. Let's move to part 3. Legal principles and enduring impact. We've seen the ethical drama. Now let's distill this down into formal legal principles for you, the listener.
Okay. We can synthesize this whole event into 3 really non-negotiable principles for public service that came out of it.
What's the first one?
The first is the accountability of rulers. This act confirmed unequivocally that public office is amana. It's a trust. The Caliph is officially classified as a trustee, which explicitly rejects any idea that the ruler somehow owns the state or its resources.
So the highest office demands the highest degree of disclosure.
Exactly. And the second principle comes directly from the return of the camel and the land: financial transparency and asset tracing.
What does that mean exactly?
It means that his action established that every single state asset taken for necessary use, whether it's a piece of land, a vehicle, some equipment, whatever, it has to be justifiable. And critically, it has to be accounted for when the official leaves office. It formalizes the idea that the Treasury's funds are sacrosanct. They're subject to a perpetual public claim even when they're legitimately being used by the chief executive.
It creates a mandatory exit audit, even if it's self-imposed.
It does. And that leads to the third principle, which is maybe the most unique part of this case: the precedent of voluntary audit.
Meaning he didn't wait to be asked.
He didn't wait for a review board or a commission to be formed. He initiated the final accounting himself. And this sets the ethical floor for everyone else in government. It demands self-policing on top of any external checks.
If the Caliph is self-auditing, then no governor or tax collector beneath him can possibly claim exemption from scrutiny.
Precisely.
Okay, let's go back to the ratio decidendi, that foundational judgment that comes out of this. We should repeat it because it just completely flips the typical hierarchy of power.
The ruling is: no one may take from public wealth except what is due and necessary. The ruler is the first to be audited.
The ruler is the first, not the last, not exempt, the first.
That ruling immediately places the highest office under the most intense legal and ethical burden. And this is critical. This wasn't just a nice moral lesson from Abu Bakr's life. It was a legal template for the developing administrative state.
So how did that practically trickle down? I mean, how did this affect, say, a regional governor in a faraway province?
The standard set by Abu Bakr and that difficulty articulated by Umar, it immediately sent a signal that this new state would not tolerate the kind of exploitation of office that was common in other empires.
If the Caliph has to return a camel?
Exactly. If the Caliph has to return a camel, imagine the consequences for a regional governor who's found to be taking far, far more for himself. It created an immediate demand for formalized administration. Later caliphs, feeling the weight of this precedent, they had to establish systems of review, of record-keeping, of accountability for all their subordinates, simply because the man at the top had demonstrated the standard.
So this single act actually drove the formalization of the state treasury, the Bayt al-Mal.
Absolutely. The administration of the Bayt al-Mal had to evolve very quickly. It couldn't just be an ad hoc collection box anymore. It moved towards establishing necessary mechanisms, formalized record-keeping systems for every bit of income and every expenditure, formalized budgets to define what was necessary spending and what wasn't, and clear accountability mechanisms for all officials.
And these weren't created in a vacuum.
Not at all. They were driven by the need to meet the standard of transparency that was set by Abu Bakr's final voluntary audit.
This is a perfect bridge to connecting this 7th century precedent to our modern world. For you listening, what's the direct lineage here? How does returning a camel 1,400 years ago influence the laws we have today?
It provides the philosophical bedrock. It's the moral foundation for the idea that public trust requires institutionalized separation and scrutiny. When you look at our modern laws, they are all just mechanisms designed to try and achieve the kind of ethical purity that Abu Bakr sought voluntarily.
Okay, let's get specific. Let's start with Auditor General institutions.
The Auditor General. What is that office? It's a designated independent official whose entire job is to scrutinize state finances and public accounts. The whole mandate is based on independence and transparency.
And the connection is?
Abu Bakr's voluntary audit is the ultimate moral mandate for an office like that. The logic is, if the Caliph himself felt compelled by his own conscience to submit his conduct to this kind of review, then a formalized mandatory system is absolutely required for everyone else.
It ensures that clearing the public ledger doesn't just rely on the conscience of the individual.
Which, as Umar lamented, is exhausting and probably unsustainable for most people. The Auditor General institutionalizes that conscience.
Okay, what about conflict of interest laws?
Conflict of interest laws exist because we recognize that fundamental dilemma Abu Bakr faced at the very beginning. You cannot serve two masters. You can't serve the public good and your own private wallet at the same time.
So these laws try to create a clean separation.
An explicit separation between public duty and private gain. Abu Bakr's return of the assets demonstrates that even the appearance or the potential for personal benefit from state property has to be mitigated. So modern laws that require officials to, say, divest from certain stocks or recuse themselves from votes, they're all just attempts to achieve that same clean slate he was aiming for.
And finally, what about declarations of assets? This is a huge one for officials entering and leaving office all over the world.
This is probably the most direct parallel. The declaration of assets is an enforced mechanism designed to ensure post office accountability. When a public official declares their wealth before they start their service and then declares it again after they finish, they are legally performing the exact same function that Abu Bakr performed spiritually and physically when he returned the land and the camel.
They're providing public proof.
Public proof that the office of power was not monetized, that they left the office, in his words, free of the burden of public wealth that wasn't legitimately theirs. The huge difference, of course, is that now it's not a voluntary act of piety. It's a mandatory, standardized process dictated by law.
And that distinction is crucial, isn't it? The difference between a voluntary standard of conscience and an enforced minimum standard of law.
It is. It's the difference between leadership by example and leadership by regulation. And that's the central point that the sources and the author, Mr. Mir, really emphasize. True leadership is defined by service, by sacrifice, by transparency, not by accumulating the perks and privileges of the office.
So, to sum this up, this single act created an enduring model. It influenced Islamic governance for centuries, and philosophically, it predates a lot of Western concepts of public trust by a millennium.
It established that governance is, at its core, an act of sacrifice. And the moment a leader prioritizes their own self-interest over absolute transparency and restraint, that's the moment the entire state structure begins to be compromised.
The strength of the state was rooted in the self-restraint of its chief executive.
That's it.
This has been an incredibly detailed deep dive. It really reveals how a single personal ethical choice at the very foundation of a state can shape legal and administrative structures for the rest of history. So let's just quickly consolidate the key takeaways for you listening.
First, we have to remember that initial setup. The necessary but intensely scrutinized state stipend, which moved Abu Bakr from being a successful merchant to a full-time public servant, but under this incredibly rigorous definition of necessity.
Then, the profound final act, that voluntary preemptive audit, returning functional state assets, the land and the camel, to ensure he was free of the burden of public wealth. An act of what you could call ethical overcompliance.
And finally, the enduring power of it all is captured in Umar's reaction, his lament, the recognition that maintaining such a high standard of sacrificial accountability would exhaust those who come after him.
It highlights that perpetual human challenge of maintaining transparency against the temptations of power and wealth.
It really does. This foundational case teaches us that while systems and laws are necessary, the ultimate integrity of governance always resides in the moral willingness of its leaders to apply the law most strictly to themselves.
Which brings us to our final provocative thought for you to consider as you reflect on all this. We've discussed how Abu Bakr's standard was based on voluntary self-scrutiny. It was driven entirely by conscience.
Whereas our modern systems, by necessity, have to rely on enforced external audits, on mandatory asset disclosures.
So here's the question. What essential element is lost when governance shifts entirely from a voluntary act of profound conscience to just a mandatory act of legal compliance?
And think about it this way. If a leader today only meets the minimum standard required by the Auditor General and the law, they check all the boxes on the disclosure form, have they truly lived up to the spirit of the public trust?
Or are they simply avoiding prosecution?
The continuous challenge for any society, really, regardless of the era or the political system, is figuring out how to institutionalize the kind of sacrifice demonstrated by its founders.
To ensure that transparency is seen as an ethical duty, not just a compliance burden.
It reminds us that true accountability isn't just about what you're forced to reveal. It's about what you choose to surrender in the name of the public good.
Something truly worth mulling over.